morning, everybody. Page 544. 544 is Vayikra. Okay, next week we'll be doing Megillat Esther. That's next week. God willing. And now we are going to be reading the first parsha in the book of Vayikra. If you look carefully at the first word, Vayikra El Moshe, God Almighty calls Moshe. You will notice what probably you've heard about in the past, the small Aleph. When we were kids, so my late father would demand from us every Shabbat, every meal, to come with the Dvar Torah. And it was demanded, because that was the olden days, when it was the parents who demanded things from the kids. That was the olden days. Now times have changed. The kids demand things from parents. So, there was a time that he mentioned to one of the siblings, it wasn't me, that if you don't have a Dvar Torah, don't come to the meal. That's how it worked. Okay? It wasn't me, it was the brothers.
See if that works.
Very good.
Yeah.
Do you do that now to your kids?
No. It's okay. Don't do that. They demand things from me. So now, this first word of Parshat Vayikra is one that demands many Divrei Torah. What is this idea of the small Aleph? And perhaps you've heard insight over the years of what it refers to. But first we have to really understand what we are walking into. It means you come to Shul Shabbos, and you open a Chumash, and you tune in, at least I hope, to the Parsha. You tune into what's being discussed. And for Bereshit and most of Shemot, more or less you could go ahead and find a story, perhaps think of an insight, hear an insight, read an insight that relates to a message. When you come to Parshat Vayikra, where they're going to be chopping up animals, right? And you're going to be talking about how to bring up limbs and fats to the altar. You're going to be talking about how to go ahead and cut the bird, not from the front, but from the neck. You're going to go ahead and be discussing different types of meal offerings. How are you going to find meaning? That's what you come for, to shul, right? A little bit of socializing, perhaps, but there got to be some meaning, something that the Parsha talks to you about. How are you going to do that? So if you are a brisker, you have no problem. Now, what do I mean by a brisker? So when I was in yeshiva in Chicago, so it was quite common that older boys that age, older meaning after they finished high school, they would spend, let's say, 3 years in studying only in the Bet Midrash, meaning full-time Torah study. And often the norm was that they would go to Israel afterwards. In the more modern schools, like where my kids went, they went right after high school to Israel. Right, I was in a more right-wing environment at the time, so going to Israel occurred after 3 years. Many boys wanted to go to a yeshiva by the name of Brisk. That was a popular yeshiva. There were 2 branches at the time of the Brisk yeshiva. And that was, at least externally, it was labeled to be for the stronger students. That was, those who were in the know, who knew more what was happening in the yeshiva knew that it was not always the case, but at least externally it sounded good that, you went to Brisk, right? So I was once sitting with one of the heads of the yeshiva, Rabbi Keller, so sein gesund. And it was a student came, I was sitting next to him at the time studying, and a student came to him asking for a letter to get into the Brisk Yeshiva. And after the student left, Rabbi Keller turned to me, and he said to me, want to know something funny? He said the following: what is this idea of the brisk yeshiva? So you know very well that there was a family, and there is a family by the name of Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik. In the 1850s, the great Volozhin yeshiva was run by a Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik the first, and Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. So Rabbi Berlin and Rabbi Soloveitchik are leading this yeshiva in the 1850s. It didn't work, meaning they had different outlooks, different philosophies. So Rabbi Soloveitchik left and became rabbi in a city called Brisk. He was a great scholar, and eventually he himself and his son, they developed a kollel there in the city of Brisk. And it worked as follows. This is what Rabbi Keller mentioned to me, that you had in the Volozhin yeshiva a system of completing all of Talmud, but they would skip the sections of the Talmud that talk about the korbanot, about the sacrifices. Those are sections that were not studied in the Volozhin yeshiva. When a student completed the whole cycle, and he would want to go ahead and fill in those gaps of the areas of Talmud known as Kodshim, where the korbanot are discussed, he would go to Brisk. Okay, so the Brisk method, and this is already from the late 19th century, was the focus on what they call Kodashim, Zvachim, Menachot, how to go ahead. And these are complex areas of Talmud because historically most of Talmud has been addressed by great rabbinic authorities in France and in Spain in the 12th and the 13th and the 14th century. And we have a lot of literature to explain the Talmud. When it comes to the sections of the Talmud that talk about sacrifices, they weren't focused at that time as well. And there's like this void. There's a void of understanding the basic meaning or the reasoning behind why things are done in a specific way. So the Brisk method was to fill that gap. And he said to me that it's funny, he said, this is Rabbi Keller, so we're going now to the late 20th century. Rabbi Keller says to me, it's funny that you have students here in the yeshiva, they didn't complete all of Talmud, right? They're not like the ones in Volozhin that all they need to do was fill a gap. They studied a little bit here. The next thing they want to do is go to the Brisk yeshiva, which kept up that tradition of studying sections of Kodashim. So he thinks that it's quite funny that it is done. Now, I didn't want to tell him that it's funny to me that you, Rabbi Keller, have an attitude of a little bit of cynicism towards the Brisk's yeshiva when both your sons actually, went there. I didn't mention that, but it was a little bit of a tension that existed in the yeshiva between the Telz elements and the Brisk elements, okay? And the idea of the Brisk, in general, the line, the motto of the Brisk approach is that you don't ask why, you ask what. Frag nicht for was, but was steht da. Don't ask why you do things. Ask what should I be doing. In other words, they'll take a text of Maimonides of the Rambam, right? And read it and find some difficulty. And try to understand what exactly is Maimonides trying to communicate. And they'll come up, and these are brilliant minds that find meaning. If Maimonides meant it or not, that's a different question, but they'll find meaning and insight. And as a result of their reading, they're going to practice it with great strictness. Brisk is a strict approach to fulfilling the letter of the law as they understand it. Now, at times it will come about with ignoring the practice of others, because if the letter of the law tells me this is what I need to do, the world around me is insignificant. I need to do what we are told. But I will not ask why it is done. I'm not going to ask why. I'm not going to ask, what am I accomplishing in the spiritual realm? Absolutely not. That was against the Brisker approach. The Brisker approach in general was very much one that rejected the mysticism. Meaning, they perhaps believed in it, but don't focus on mysticism. What's mysticism? I want to know, when I'm shaking my lulav, what worlds am I impacting? Because there are different realms, and I know that when I shake it in that direction, I'm plugging into that realm. And when I'm shaking it in the other direction, there's another realm. That you could do if you're a chassid, that you could do if you're a Kabbalist. If you're a brisker, all you're going to do is you're going to figure out exactly how it should be done, and you're going to be so focused on shaking it because that's what you want to accomplish. Frag nicht, far was, but was, what should I be doing? That is the brisk approach. Okay? Telz, on the other hand, the old Telz tradition, we've talked about this in the past, was a little bit more of an understanding of what's being done. A little bit, we're not going to call it mysticism, but a little bit they had a series of lectures and publications known as the Shi'urei Da'at, lectures of knowledge, more of understanding. So this was a little bit of a different school than the brisk approach. So you have brisk and you have a little bit of Telz. And what was interesting for me is that when I went in to be Menachem Oval a few months ago by the Levin family, the son who took over the position of his father had a brisk education, and he came back to the Telz yeshiva. And we were sitting there in the shiva, and his son turns to him and says, Pa, there's a phone call. So again, this is the Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Levin, Rosh Yeshiva, current Rosh Yeshiva of Tel Chicago, inherits a position from his father, a very much worthy individual, one I have a tremendous amount of respect, a wholesome person, and he's handed a phone during the shiva. His first motion to his son was, I told you I don't want phone calls, meaning his sense was that if I'm greeting people who traveled, I don't take the phone. Meaning that was his assessment, that you don't pick up a phone in a shiva house if you have actual people that made it there. Interesting, right? So his first indication was, son was, I told you no, he says, it's Rabbi Barrett, some senior rabbi who's in his late 90s, so that the son made a decision, an executive decision, that this one his dad will be taking. So he takes the phone, and I hear Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda just listening there to some kind of intense, it didn't sound like words of comfort, it sounded more like a lecture that he was getting. And he said, thank you, he put back the phone, and he's a very open and honest person. For me, it's always a sign of greatness. When you have a person that doesn't need to hide anything. He's very honest about himself, and he said, I just got a Musar Shmuz. I just got a talk from this Rabbi Baron, who's an old Telzer, and he was telling me how important it is to keep up the Telz tradition and not bring brisk into Telz. In other words, he was an understanding that this is a person that had some education from brisk, comes into Telz, he's a blend of both, and he got here a shmuz to be sure to stick to the tradition of what you inherited. So this is something that's fascinating, and this, by the way, is very much Vayikra material, because for the brisker who wants to figure out what exactly must be done, and he wants to study about the korbanot, and he wants to figure out how exactly does the Kohen take the flour out of the bowl. There's a section of flour that is burnt. How does he take it out exactly? What is the motion of the fingers? What about if a little bit of the frankincense gets mixed in, right? If they sprinkle the blood and there's a section that's supposed to be placed on top and it's placed on the bottom, how do I fix it? So if your whole commitment to Judaism is it's the Word of God and I want to know exactly how it's done and that's how I am going to find meaning, you're going to love this section. And by the way, they have expertise that is incredible, that they could go ahead and take practices that have not been part of our Judaism, not been part of our daily routine for 2,000 years, and they could give you in-depth analysis of how it's done. I think that's incredible. So if you're a brisker, you will have no difficulty in finding meaning in this week's Parsha. Just in case you're not, we're going to have to work and figure something out. How do we find meaning in Vayikra? Now, if you are... Is it okay if I close the door? Now, if you are a follower of Maimonides in the guide, who tells you the following, that you should know, don't view korbanot as an ideal, but rather God commands them due to the fact that the human being has this desire to connect to the higher being. And at that time it was through offerings. Therefore God Almighty commanded that they should do it in a specific way. So that also creates a level of trouble, because if it was given to me only because of human nature of 3,400 years ago, How do I connect to it? So you might have some issues as well, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a suggestion of how to deal with Vayikra, but we're going to go back to our Dvar Torah on the word Vayikra itself. You know, you've heard people saying that they feel they have a calling. You know, people do some incredible work for community, for chesed, and they feel that it's a calling. It's a Jewish concept as well. There's actually a statement in the Talmud that every single day there is a voice that comes out from Har Sinai that is calling us. It's a calling. Vayikra. God He's calling us. He's calling us indeed. And it's a very important word because, you know, sometimes I wake up in the morning, right, and I'm not exactly in a mood, let's say, to daven. Okay? No, it's not, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I don't feel spiritual. I've been trained that if you didn't daven that day, right, you're incomplete. So it's the training, it's a good training, by the way. But when I finish davening, what am I thinking about? What's my thought? Okay, Baruch Hashem, Yoytze Given, right? I fulfilled my, quote-unquote, obligation. Now, that's nothing to be proud of. I feel it sometimes. Now, in some ways it's good, because I'm going to keep it up. But come on, is that how we... In other words, I have this psychologically. I've been brainwashed as a child between my schooling and home that it's a must. I've been brainwashed that I have to do it. So I do it, and I got it over with. It's problematic. Why? I'm making my tefillah into what's known as a keva, something that I'm obligated to do every single day. Right? Some people feel they're obligated to go ahead and every single morning walk their dog. So lahavdil, for me, my training is that I have to go ahead and daven. That's not the way to do it. What is the proper approach to davening? The proper approach is the fact that there is indeed a calling. There is this voice. And when you hear a voice, right, in another room that's calling you, you walk towards that room because you want to go ahead and see what the person wants. You want to face them. You want to hear their voice. You want to interact with them. The ideal way is a calling, right? And therefore we have hopefully better days. That there are days that I wake up and I'm appreciative. You know that at the end of Shemona Esrei, we have after the bracha v'machazir shchinato leTzion, right? Right? It's talking about the service in the Beit Hamikdash, right? Avodah. And right afterwards, we talk about modim. They go together. Because if you develop within yourself an appreciation for the world, for our tradition, for life, for the idea that we could breathe fresh air, if there's an appreciation, that could be used for avodah. In other words, a good way to wake up is to actually feel modeh ani lefanech. I'm grateful. I'm up. Now that I'm grateful and I recognize that there's an Almighty that returned the soul to me, let me go ahead and have a conversation with Him. Right. So there are ways to work on that bad mood day. Right. We all have those ups and downs. Unless we're dealing, angels, they say, are called omdim. Angels are called ones who are omdim. You know that when we put our tefillah together, we want to be like angels. We keep our feet together. We have 2 feet because we are not in one place. We go up and down. We have our ups and downs. And we have to recognize that we have our ups and downs. When you have a down, right, you accept it. You accept it. When you have an up, you know, you go ahead and you're grateful. You hopefully work with it. The reality is that we have to understand there's vayikra. Vayikra. God is calling us. God is calling us. It is not something I need to do because I want to get back to my real life. And my real life is to enjoy myself, to have a good meal. My real life is to have some entertainment. That's not my real life. My real life is a relationship, but at times I need a little bit of food and entertainment to go ahead and remain sane. So, vayikra, a crucial word for existence. Now, what about the small aleph? You see in your Chumash that little small aleph there? Aleph Ktana, and on the side, on page 544, you will see where it says Aleph Ze'ira. What is like a Za'ir small? A small aleph. So there are divrei Torah, many insights presented, but the common denominator from almost all the explanations presented is that look at that word without the aleph. Right? Start off. In other words, obviously it's a Vayikra, but briefly look at that word without the aleph. And it is Vayakar, Lashon Mikre. Mikre. And rabbinic tradition tells us that this was a word that God Almighty used when he communicated with Bilam. Bilam, he was a prophet too. He had a conversation with God. He saw some kind of light for whatever reason. Bilam is the Vayakar, Mikre. On the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu, so the text wants you to contrast. While Moshe Rabbeinu, and by the way, there's a very significant moment. They have a tabernacle. There's a place to communicate. We still communicate through that tabernacle because we face the east, right? So we are still tapping into this conversation that starts with this one word. This one word that is the voice of God, we want to contrast it to the voice or the word that describes Bilam's relationship to God. Okay? And Vayikra, there's always a Vayikra, right? It is something that is eternal. We're always hearing that voice. Every single day, right? We turn to the east. Every single day we ask ourselves, what would the Torah guide us in making such a decision? Every decision in life, Torah values really guide us. Right? Do you go ahead and make a big issue out of something? Right? What are your priorities? Everything in life is guided by Torah. We are always hearing and turning to Yerushalayim for that voice. It is eternal. Mikre, Vayakar, Bilam's quote-unquote morality comes from something that is Mikre. It's temporary. It's temporary. And commentators note that here in this verse, what is being presented to us is an understanding that there is a difference between eternal values and temporary values. Torah is eternal. The values of 3,400 years ago presented in this text are the values of today. Values that a society decides to go ahead and practice, right, for social harmony, because they feel it is ethical, those things could change. To prove it to you, think back 45 years ago, right? And go start telling me about the values that existed 45 years ago. Are they in any way, if you look out on the street and what's happening in the world and the media, has the world changed a little bit when it comes to values? Remember there was a movie, Mr. Holland's Opus. Opus. Well, it was very powerful for educators, right? A guy that dreamt of becoming a composer, conductor, and he was a teacher. But how do you touch lives, really? You know, if you're a teacher, if you're concerned about it, you're very, very powerful now. So there's a scene. He starts his chinuch. He starts as an educator in the 1960s, and they rename the school as he's teaching there in the first year of the J.F. Kennedy schools, right after the assassination. And you see how the girls are dressed in the 1960s, right? And Mamish Beis Yaakov, it looks like, right? In other words, the principal would be sure that the knee was covered with the 4 inches, whatever it was, right? Those are the values of the 1960s. Then, and this is not a movie of the 21st century, which God knows what exactly would be happening there, right? In a public school in the 21st century. But by the 1990s already, right, the clothes are a little bit different. And the hair is already, there's no such thing as having natural colors. If it's not red, blue, and white, your hair is something. So society changes. And therefore, when we talk about the values that exist in a society, those things are temporary. So here we have it. Here's an insight, and this is your first Dvar Torah. The text tells us, Vayikra with a small aleph, to share with you this idea that there is a difference between eternal values of Torah and those things that are temporary. But let's start with a question on that. Okay, let's challenge this a little bit. I teach in chat. Okay, what we are discussing this year has to do with testimony and witnesses and capital punishment and the function of a Jewish court. And at times, we're going to be sharing things that the Talmud indicates. For example, the Talmud tells us that if you want to go ahead and kill someone for a crime, for committing a homicide, so we turn to the two witnesses. And we ask the two witnesses who are standing there in court, did you warn the person not to do it? Okay. If they say yes, we ask them, did you see it? Were you standing together as you saw the crime? Then they ask, when you warned him, did he commit the crime immediately or perhaps he forgot? A whole series of questions are asked to these witnesses that basically, after going through them and putting them together, you can never have a conviction. Okay? So the question these students asked, and it's a fair question because it's a question that was asked for many, many years already, if you establish a system where you make it impossible to go ahead and punish and convict a perpetrator, what kind of system is this? And then you have a statement in a Mishnah where the great Rabbi Akiva says that if I would have been a member of a court that was involved in a capital case, no one would have ever died because I would have acted like a Jewish lawyer and asked so many confusing questions that the witnesses would basically contradict one another. And the student says, so wait a second, you create a system, right? We have a whole series of punishments, but then they make it impossible to go ahead and actually kill someone. Does this make sense? This is the question that they ask. And to give them an answer, I often go back to my own chinuch, and I go back to the late 1980s, to my yeshiva. We had in the yeshiva what they called va'adim, little groups of study, and the mashgiach and the yeshiva, Rabbi Lifshitz, got together a small group of some of us, maybe we were 4 or 5, and Friday night we would study the work of Rabbeinu Nisim. Rabbeinu Nisim. Rabbeinu Nisim lives in Spain in the 14th century. He was a great Talmudic authority, but he was also a thinker and a philosopher. And he gave drashot that were in philosophical issues, asking questions that the rational mind of the 14th century would ask on Jewish text. And he struggled with these issues. He struggled very much with these issues. And he asks, for example, if we are going to go ahead and only follow the rabbinic law as it is presented in the Talmud, so he tells us, if we're going to follow that, yipased hasidur hamedini legamre. Social justice or social harmony would collapse if we only follow the Talmudic law. Now you realize he's taking what we just labeled as eternal, right? Values that are not limited to a specific time. And this great rabbi gets up and says, if we follow it as is, right, society would collapse. So he tells us the following that you have to know. Jewish law has 2 levels. There is the level that's in the books, but then there's a practical level. What he called this is, the first one is Batei Dinim, and the second one is the Melech. In the words, I'll quote his words first. HaMelech, meaning when we are functioning as a society as we should, we have the courts that follow the rabbinic law, but we have a king. What is the king about? HaMelech Yachol Ladun, the king could go ahead and judge without the hatra'ah, without the witnesses, but rather his main focus is to do what is good for the kibbutz hamedini, for society, for social harmony. So you have 2 laws. You have laws that are like as a foundation, but you don't live in a foundation, right? It's nice to have a very, very solid foundation because it gives you direction. You can build it. You can erect a nice building when there's a foundation, but you don't live in it. You have to have someone that is practical to see what society needs. He notes that after we no longer have a kingdom, suddenly the judges have a double responsibility. Responsibility number 1 is to know the ethical teachings of the Torah, and then to see what is practical. Now, so here we run into a little bit of trouble. I tell you that Torah law, eternal. Other things are temporary. But now we are saying that a functional rabbinic court has to have the ability to do things on a temporary basis. How do we deal with this? Right? This is a question that there's a concept in Judaism called Hora'at Sha'ah, Hora'at Sha'ah, right? A very important concept. You know, for example, here in the shul, when we arrived 10 years ago, so we had the first night slichos, like in many synagogues. It was done after midnight, and that's a very old and valid tradition. So what happens is that it's Motzei Shabbos. You get home and like you fight sleep until 1 o'clock in the morning. You come here. There's usually a lecture. That's when you usually chop your sleep a little bit before slichos. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning we have slichos. Now I realized at the time that it's a challenge because the chevra here 1 o'clock in the morning was not exactly an ideal time. So I spoke it over with some people I respect. And I got, quote unquote, a green light to make an adjustment, and we have it now at 11. But we made it clear that we are not changing the ideal. It still remains an ideal 1 o'clock in the morning. In other words, if suddenly, we regain energy as individuals or as a community, we're going to go back to the 1 o'clock in the morning. But we made an adjustment. We called it Hora'at Sha'ah. Hora'at Sha'ah. Now, Hora'at Sha'ah could last for a couple years, but the idea is it is a temporary teaching. We have that great sensitivity in Judaism, that there is what's known as a fundamental, we're not going to call it a truth, we're going to call it fundamental practice, and then there is something that is needed because as times change, you have to adjust to keep Torah alive. You know, the writing of Torah text, the oral tradition. Today we are in a generation of many, many, many books. There's an endless amount of Jewish books. You've noticed that. And if you think in English there are a lot of books, in Hebrew there's an incredible amount of books. There was a time that oral tradition was not to be written. Oral tradition was called oral tradition because you had to keep it oral. There was a great benefit there, but in the early 3rd century comes the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and he realizes this is a nation that is being dispersed. If we're going to only keep traditions orally and only expect the young student to memorize everything that he needs to memorize, Torah is going to be gone. So therefore, he said the following. This is based on a verse. Et la'asot la'Hashem. This is a rabbinic reading of this verse. It is a time to do for God. Meaning, when our agenda is purely for the sake of God, then we could go ahead and violate something of the Torah. Heferu Toratecha. And again, you have to have parties that know exactly what the will of God is. He wants Torah to survive, we can't survive. And he begins the process of recording Torah.
How do you reconcile that with the concept of Horat as the second day of Yom Tov?
So how do you deal with which aspect? There's like 3 different ways to...
Well, you talked about the temporary adjustment.
When it comes to... We are in that delicate place. I give the marshal of a father going with his child to the mall, going to the Pasha Mall, and then suddenly the father gets a call that he has to run somewhere for 15 minutes, right? So he turns to the child, right? I don't know if today could do it, but 25 years ago, you show him a specific spot. You show him a specific spot in the mall, right? And you say, stand here. Do not leave for the next 15 minutes. I'll be back. After run, take care of something, but don't leave. Okay, and then we're talking about a smart kid. Now the child has a level of discomfort because there's some noise coming from... Dad said I have to stand here, right? Now, if suddenly there's a marching band going through the mall, right, and he knows he's going to get knocked over, the child will keep his eye on that location, right, the smart child, step away, and when the band passes, return to the spot, okay? When dad's not there, he tries very, very hard not to budge. There are times that he has to. Any adjustment we make, any adjustment that the rabbinic authorities make, and they have made, it was always with that understanding that we are not where we belong. We don't have our Father with us. We don't have the court. Do you know, by the way, that if we would have a court in Jerusalem, if we would have a Sanhedrin, and we would present to them, and you would have, many have the inconvenience or difficulties with a specific practice, we would present it to them. They were a body that could adjust things. They have the power to say goodbye to Kitniot, for example. But we don't have that body. So therefore, we are like that child. We are, what was that?
Why do we not
Why do we not
establish?
Because we can't agree on anything. Because we
We'll
can't.
never have one again?
I think I'm a believer, I'm an optimist. I believe that we're going to eventually have a messianic era. And as my older brother always says, that people wonder if the Messiah is going to be coming in a natural way or supernatural way. So he says that if all the Jews agree on one person, there's nothing more supernatural than that. And the reality is, if we all agree on one person that he is actually a leader, there's no greater sign than that. And such a body will be established. And then suddenly this court will have a tremendous ability to deal with issues that are very difficult to go ahead and deal with. Some of them they're going to probably say to us, come on, you can deal with it. Others are going to say, you're right, no longer relevant. Because when you have such a body, it's like the father who returns, who could grab the child's hand and move him to a different location. We are not in our ideal state. It's something we have to accept. We're not in our ideal state. There are times that even in this state, rabbis have to make some kind of adjustments because it is et la'asot la'Hashem. Now, the main message I take when I have this idea that there are fundamental teachings and then temporary ones, there always is a message to learn from the fundamental one, even when it's not practiced. And the example is, Torah suddenly is recorded. Torah is recorded, and today we have lots of books. But the concept still exists for the following reason. You study history. Jews had a very strong presence in Spain into the 15th century. Jews had a very strong presence, obviously, in Germany. And every country has its own history. For example, France after 1306, there's a significant decline. You don't hear of great rabbinic institutions in France after the beginning of the 14th century. Germany had its declines during the Black Plague, and then again there were massacres in 1421. You mentioned Poland. When does Poland become not just significant, but the most significant country for Torah? When does that occur? So it starts off, Jews already are in Poland probably by the 12th, 13th century, but not with institutions, not with yeshivot. And if you had a student that had the ability to one day make a contribution, he traveled to Germany. One of those students in the middle of the 15th century was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Polak. And I'm sure you could guess why he had that last name, because he comes to a German yeshiva, and he was known as the Polak. He was known as the Polak. Now, Rav Yaakov Polak was extremely wise and bright and knowledgeable, and he married into a wealthy family, and he was supported there, and his popularity, he was gaining popularity at a very young age, in his 20s, late 20s. Eventually there was a major controversy that developed in the German yeshiva, where Yaakov Polak is. It had to do about what's known as a miyun. It was a young girl that was married off as a child, the norm at that time. The family of the young girl realized that the fellow is a good for nothing. So they wanted her to get up and declare that she wants to nullify the marriage, since she wasn't technically married off by her father, but by her mother. And this is something that was done in Talmudic times. Concept that exists. The young girl, when she becomes mature, could say that due to the fact that I wasn't technically married according to Torah law, it was only rabbinic because it was my mother who married me off, so therefore she could walk away. A lot of technical details, obviously. It is known as miyun. Great rabbis in Poland, already in the beginning of the 15th century, said we should no longer do it. Rabbi Yaakov Polak, young rabbi, he felt that in this case it should be done. So he got up, disagreeing with all senior rabbis in the German yeshivot, declared this young lady is released. There was a big tumult. A younger rabbi, how can you do so? He said, I could, because I have the knowledge. The tumult was so great that he had to leave and go back to Poland. He had a following. They followed him to Poland. And he was followed to Poland, and he establishes the yeshiva eventually in Krakow. And his disciple, Shalom Shachna, had a disciple, the Ramah, and that's how Polish Jewry really starts. Okay, Rav Yaakov Polak. Now, Rav Yaakov Polak, a great authority, really, the foundation of Polish Jewry is based on Rav Yaakov Polak. So you want to say, okay, so show me his writings, right? You want to know more about him. You want to read his responsa. You want to read his halachic work. Rav Yaakov Polak did not record his Torah teachings, and he did not allow his students to record his Torah teachings. He said, nope, no recording. Eventually he said, Rabbi Yaakov, here you are, like look what you have accomplished. Why can we not record your Torah teachings? He said, it's very simple. If I'm going to go ahead and start teaching halachic psak, and it's going to be recorded, a generation later they're going to think this is a must to follow because the great Rav Yaakov Polak said so. But in a generation from now, in 30 years from now, maybe the situation will be different and the needs will be different. Maybe they need to be a little bit stricter on a specific issue. Maybe they need to be a little bit more lenient. To go ahead and record, what are you doing it? What are you doing? You're canonizing a practice. That's not the Jewish way of doing things. In every generation, the rabbis have to assess the needs, the minhagim, the abilities of the people, and to keep it just right. You don't want to overwhelm them, but you want to go ahead and be sure that you are still protecting the faith and protecting the people. Rav Yaakov Polak basically takes a Jewish concept of not recording the oral tradition, and he uses it not so much that he believed there's a prohibition, but that became a foundation for him for practice. So here we go. You have the eternal. He learned from those eternal values. You have the temporary, a need to go ahead and record Torah. You learn a message from that which is eternal. So therefore, this is all an introduction really to the Parsha, and I want to go ahead and share with you two examples of how to read Parshat Vayikra. Now I think you could understand. You may not be doing it at home. You're not going to be slaughtering animals, right? You're not going to go ahead and burning limbs on an altar. But there are values here you could learn. Two examples. Example number one. When you burn an animal, right, there's a lot to be burnt. When you burn a chicken on a mizbeach, a little bird, there's very little to be burnt. Nevertheless, the Torah tells us you should know that when it comes to the innards of the bird, the innards, the stomach, right, don't put it on the altar. Ask the rabbis why not, meaning you would want to increase the volume of that which is being placed on the altar. So the rabbis tell us the following. A bird, where does it get its food from? Bird comes into someone's backyard without asking, without permission, and will go ahead and eat a few seeds. The animal, on the other hand, is fed food from the owner. The bird takes from others. A bird violates Zillah. Kodesh Baruch Hu wants you to go ahead, and when you think about this section, and think about the bird, and think about the fact that there are sections of the animal that are not burned because it did not take that which it had a right to, you learn the lesson of sensitivity to the property of others. So again, you are not learning so much from the actual practice, you're learning from the core message. That's how you learn Vayikra. Tune into those little messages that were relevant then and are relevant today even without a temple. One other example, and then I'm going to ask you to look inside on the beginning of the 5th chapter, which is on page 560. Okay, it's talking about what's known as a korban, page 560, korban oleh v'yored. A korban where it's variable. If you are wealthy, you bring a high-end korban. If you are poor, you bring a low korban. It starts off with a violation, and we're going to read this complete verse. Verse 1 of chapter 5 on the bottom of 560. If you have a nefesh, a person, Ki techeta. That what? That sinned. V'shama kolala. For example, there was an acceptance of an oath. We'll explain to what it relates to. V'hu ed o ra'a o yada. In other words, he's called to court. He takes an oath. There's something he knew. There's something he saw. There's something he heard. But he doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want to share that information. So we are told here that the violation is that you have something to say that could help society. So the verse ends with the words, Im lo yagid, if he does not testify, by not testifying, information you know that could protect others, venasa avono, you shall bear the guilt. You shall bear this violation. Now, what is it talking about? You know something. People, often we talk about Lashon Hara, so people think I can't say anything. Do you know that there is a violation that is much greater than Lashon Hara? If you know something, you have information, and a person is entering into a business partnership. You know that the fellow is a crook, and they come and ask you a question. Tell me, can I enter into a partnership with this shraga? And you say to yourself, I've been taught so much about Lashon Hara, I've seen so many posters in school about Lashon Hara, I'm going to keep quiet, I'm not going to say anything. Comes this verse and other verses and tell us that's not Judaism. Judaism is a responsibility to a society. There are things you shouldn't say, but there are things you must say. If you have a teacher, right, that abuses children, there's this big to do in Israel now about this Australian teacher that abused girls, right? Obviously someone knew something about it, obviously, but what do? They keep quiet. What does the Torah tell us? Im lo yagid v'nasavono. You have a responsibility, right? Not to yourself. It's not a religion of, okay, I don't want to talk. You have a responsibility to a society. A key teaching here. One more thing. If you look at the Im lo yagid, it's a unique law. What's the uniqueness of the law?
Has a vav in it.
Lamed vav aleph. So I'm there. One other place in Torah where there's a law with a lamed vav aleph, and that has to do. You're putting some pressure on the Balkara there. That has to do with Rachel. When Rachel hid these trafim, which were some kind of images that were worshipped. And her father comes, and she was hiding it by sitting on them. And she turns to her father and says, I can't stand up now because, I'm going through my period. I can't really stand up, right? And the word she uses is also, lo uchal, I can't do it. A lo with the lamed vav aleph is a no that is a selfish, like lo means back to me. A no that is back to me. A no, right? I can't do this because it's not good for me. It's all about me. It's a heavy no. It's a no that relates to you thinking only about yourself. And here we have it, Parshat Vayikra, Parshat about korbanot and about spirituality. The lesson is you have a responsibility, just as a person thinks about themselves and they don't want to enter into an environment where they're going to get hurt, or about your family, you have to apply that to community as well. Im lo yagid, if you say no because you're thinking about lo with the vav, because you are thinking about yourself, that's a violation. This is a teaching that's not just about korbanot, it's a teaching about what our Judaism is about, that we hear that voice that's calling us, think about Torah, think about Judaism, but think about Klal Yisrael, think about a community. That's how you practice your Judaism, and that's how we make this text relevant for us today as well. I do thank you. Next week, Megillat Esther. Everyone have a wonderful...
Shkaya.